She was 20 years old. She had $66 in a mason jar on the floor of a friend's car, and the Shipwright's shack at the end of Penner's Cove Road had been listed in the county disposal notices for so long that the ink on the original posting had faded to near illegibility. $10. Everything on the property included, as is, no exceptions. The listing described a workshop and associated outbuildings, circa 1896, on a tidal lot at the edge of the cove, with an unfinished vessel on the stocks in the main shed that had been there, according to the county's records, since 1971. She had called the county office from a gas station, and a man named Orvis had said yes. The vessel was still there, and no, he did not know what kind it was. And yes, the keel space beneath it had been boarded over at some point. And no, he could not tell her what was under the boards, because no one had looked. What was under those boards had been waiting since the summer of 1971. It was going to give her back more than she knew she had lost. This channel exists for stories like this one. Subscribe if you'd like. It costs nothing, and it keeps us going. And when you finish tonight, drop us a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Her name was Sable Voss. She had grown up in a town called Denner's Point, a coastal town of 6,000 people that lived on fishing, boat repair, and a summer tourist season that lasted 12 weeks and was the economic engine of everything else. Her father, Owen, had worked as a marine electrician, a man who spent his days threading wire through bilges and engine rooms, and who came home smelling of salt and sealant, and was quiet in the particular way of men who work in small, confined spaces and have learned to conserve themselves. He was not a distant man. He was an inward one. And there is a difference, though it is a difference that takes years to understand. He coached Sable's youth sailing team for 3 seasons when she was 10 through 12, and he had been good at it. Patient, specific. The kind of coach who watched what a child was already doing well and built from there rather than correcting what they did wrong. Sable had loved sailing from the first moment she was on the water, and Owen had seen that and fed it the way careful people feed things they love in other people, quietly, consistently, without making a production of it. Her mother, Irene, was a bookkeeper who kept the accounts for 4 businesses in Denner's Point and had the organized, unhurried quality of a woman who has learned that chaos is optional for those willing to do the work of preventing it. She and Owen had been together since they were 19 and had the kind of marriage that is not dramatic but is solid. The way a well-built hull is solid. It doesn't call attention to itself, but you notice its absence when it isn't there. Owen died when Sable was 16, a myocardial infarction on a Tuesday afternoon in the engine room of a charter boat, a death that was fast and without warning, and which the marine electrician who took his route the following week said had probably been painless, which was the kind of comfort that is true and also inadequate, and which Irene accepted with the same steadiness she brought to everything. Sable finished high school. She was not exceptional in school. She was capable and careful and somewhat restless in the way of people who learn better from doing than from reading. But she was exceptional on the water. And the boat repair yard at the south end of the harbor, a place called Dunn's Ways, hired her at 17 for summer work and kept her on in the off-season because she was precise and she was fast and she didn't need to be told something twice. She learned fiberglass repair, electrical systems, basic engine work. She intended to learn more. She intended, eventually, to build. The thing that derailed it was her uncle Cresswell. Cresswell Voss was Owen's younger brother by 7 years, and he had been on the edges of Sable's life in the way that certain relatives are always on the edges, present at the right occasions, friendly in the surface manner of someone who knows the names of the important things in your life without quite knowing the things themselves. He ran a marine hardware distributorship from a warehouse in the next county and had done well enough at it to have opinions about doing well, which he shared freely. After Owen died, he began appearing at the house with some regularity, checking on Irene, he said, making sure they were all right, which they were, as much as they could be, and his visits were welcome enough until they weren't. The problem was the trust. Owen had taken out a life insurance policy when Sable was born. The policy had a face value of $48,000 and named Irene as primary beneficiary, with Sable named as secondary. When Owen died, the money came to Irene, which was correct, and Irene deposited it into a savings account and told Sable it would be there for her education and for starting out, which was also correct. And Sable had understood this as the thing it was, her father's last provision, the careful act of a man who had worked in small spaces and saved where he could, and known the water was not always kind. Cresswell had had a partnership dispute at his distributorship. He did not explain the specifics to Irene. He explained only that he needed a bridge, that the resolution was coming, that it was a matter of weeks and not months, and that family was what you could rely on when business turned difficult. Irene had listened. She had looked at her hands. She had said she would think about it. She lent him $22,000. She told Sable on the same evening she did it, sitting in the kitchen with her hands around a mug that said Denner's Point Harbor Festival 2003, looking not at Sable but at the mug. She said the money would come back. She said Cresswell had said so. She said she was sorry. Sable had sat across from her mother and said nothing for a long moment. Then she had said, "Did you ask me?" It was not quite a question. Irene had said she hadn't wanted to put it on her. She had said it was her money to decide about. She had said Cresswell had asked her not to involve other people, which was the part that Sable turned over later, and later still, and understood more clearly each time she turned it. Cresswell had not wanted other people involved. Because other people, specifically Sable, who had her father's practical mind and would have asked the questions Irene had not asked, would have said no. She stayed 2 more months at the house. She did not stay out of forgiveness, she was not there yet, but out of love for her mother, which is a different thing and sometimes requires more of you. Then she took a room above a chandlery on the harbor front and worked her hours at Dunn's Ways and sent a portion of each paycheck home, because the $22,000 did not come back, not in weeks and not in months. Cresswell's partnership dispute resolved in a direction that did not include repayment. He said he was sorry. He sent a card. Sable's name was not on it. She was broke in the way that is not dramatic, but is constant, the way of someone who has enough for today and is not certain about next week, who checks the balance before every purchase and knows the exact number without looking. She was 20 years old, and she had $66 and the listing for a Shipwright's shack at the end of Penner's Cove Road, and she was done waiting for things to come back that were not coming back. The county property officer was named Orvis Bale, and he drove her to the property himself, because the access road required a vehicle with clearance, and Sable had arrived by bus. He was 58, lean, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed to a point, and he had the resigned amiability of a man who has worked for a county long enough to have stopped being surprised by what county ownership produces. He said on the drive that the property had been on the disposal list for 4.5 years, and that she was the 3rd person to call about it, and the first to want to actually see it. The shack was not a shack in the diminutive sense. It was a working shipwright's shop, 53 feet long and 31 wide, built from timber frame construction in the way of late 19th century maritime buildings, heavy posts and beams of white oak, pegged at the joints rather than nailed, the kind of joinery that does not fail unless the wood itself fails, and the wood had not failed. The siding was gone in large sections, and the roof had two areas of significant failure that let in columns of cove light and had permitted the weathering of the interior floor and some of the lower structure. But the frame itself, the bones of the building, was sound in a way that was immediately apparent to anyone who understood how to look at a frame. Inside the main shed, on a set of timber building stocks that ran the length of the shop's center, was the hull. It was a wooden boat, roughly 38 feet long, built to a design that Orvis said he didn't know and had not tried to identify. The hull was lapstrake planked, overlapping strakes of what appeared to be white cedar, fastened with bronze rivets that had greened over the decades but had not corroded through. The topsides had weathered. The bottom needed attention. But the shape of the hull was true. No hogging, no twisting. The curve of the bilge still clean and fair from stem to stern. Whoever had started this boat had known exactly what they were doing. Under the hull, in the space between the building stocks and the shed floor, someone had laid a platform of heavy plank, roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, fitted to sit directly beneath the keel of the hull. The plank was a different timber from everything else in the shop, drier, more recent by several decades, deliberately cut and placed. On the forward edge of the platform, someone had driven a single iron spike through the plank into the frame below, and to the spike had been tied a length of cord, and at the end of the cord was a brass tag, and on the tag, stamped into the metal, were 3 words: "Open when ready." Sable knelt on the shop floor and read the tag twice. Then she stood up and looked at Orvis and said she would take it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the hull, at the keel platform, at the brass tag still swinging slightly on its cord. Then he said, "The estate is a man named Donald Keel. He owned this property from 1954 to 1971, when his wife's health required them to move closer to her family. He left the boat unfinished because he had no choice. He died in 1988. He paused. The tag was noted in the county assessment. Nobody could explain it. Nobody tried to look under the platform because it was in the county's interest not to open anything they'd then have to account for." Sable untied the brass tag from the spike and put it in her jacket pocket. She said she would be ready when she was ready. Orvis accepted this without comment. He wrote her receipt in his deliberate hand, collected her $10, and said the deed would transfer in 10 business days. She walked back to the road while he drove because she wanted the time, and the Cove Road in October was the kind of walk that asks something of you and gives back more than you put in. The water through the trees, the smell of low tide, the particular quality of coastal light at 4 in the afternoon when the season is turned and the tourists are gone, and a place is briefly only itself. She met Tess Fairborn the next morning. Tess was 69, and she had lived in the house at the top of Penner's Cove Road for 41 years, which meant she had been Donald Keel's neighbor for the last years of the shop's active life, and had watched it stand empty ever since. She arrived at the shop door at 8 in the morning with a thermos of tea and a look of someone who had been deciding to do this for a long time and had finally done it. She was a retired boatyard bookkeeper. She had worked at Dunn's Ways, of all places, from 1974 to 2009, which made her a thread that connected Sable's working life to this place before either of them had known it. She came in. She looked at the hull. She was quiet for a moment in the specific way of people who are feeling something they have not felt in a long time and are not going to rush through it. "Donald Keel," she said finally. "You knew him? He was here when I moved to the Cove Road. Last few months before he left." She walked slowly around the hull, looking at the planking. He used to leave his offcuts at the end of the lane. Good timber, cedar and oak, whatever he'd trimmed from the build. He left it there for whoever needed it. He'd been doing it for years. People came and took what they needed. He never said anything about it, just left it. She touched one of the bronze rivets with the tip of one finger, very gently. When he left, the pile of offcuts was still there for about a year. Then it was gone, and then there was just the lane, and then eventually even the memory of the pile was mostly gone. She looked at Sable. I've thought about that pile of timber for 41 years. Sable looked at the hull and thought about the pile of timber, and the brass tag, and the cord and the spike, and about a man who finished everything except the boat, and left the boat for whoever came next, with a brass tag that said to open the thing under the keel when she was ready, and she understood, standing in the shop in the October light, that ready had a specific meaning here. It did not mean when the conditions were right. It meant when you had proven to yourself that you were the kind of person who would treat the finding with the seriousness it deserved. She had been in the shop for less than 24 hours. She was not ready yet. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, you know what Donal Keel was. And you know we are getting close to what he left. If you haven't subscribed yet and would like to, right now is a fine moment. It means more than we can say. And stay close, this is where it opens. She gave it 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, word moved through Denner's Point and along the Cove Road and through the small world of people who care about wooden boats in the way that word always moves through that world, carefully, with a kind of reverence, because people who love wooden boats understand that certain things are rare and that rarity asks something of you. Tess came back on the 3rd day with a man named Hartley Quirk, who was 83 and had been a planking apprentice at a boatyard in the next county in the early 1960s, and who had heard, from Tess, about the hull on the stocks and had driven down to see it because he said he would not forgive himself if he didn't. He walked the length of the hull twice without saying a word, and then stood at the bow and put one hand on the stem and said, quietly, that it was the finest amateur planking job he had ever seen. He said he had seen professional yards do worse. He said whoever had built it had understood the cedar. A young woman named Petra Combe, who was studying small craft design at the Maritime School 2 counties up the coast, came by on the 2nd Saturday because Bram Soloway had mentioned the Leithwaite design to her, and she had made the drive specifically to see it. She spent an hour with the drawings and 2 hours looking at the hull from every angle, and then said she had been looking for an example of a Leithwaite No. 7 for her thesis for 8 months, and had thought none remained unaltered. She asked Sable whether she would permit documentation. Sable said yes. Petra came back the following week with a camera and a measuring tape and a notebook. And she was careful and thorough and respectful. And when she left, she shook Sable's hand and said it was the most important thing she had seen in her 2 years of study. Sable thanked her and went back to sweeping. Tess, on one of her visits, told her more about Donal Keel than she had offered on the first morning. She said he had been in this shop every day for 15 years, starting before sunrise in the summer and ending after dark, and that the sound of his mallet had been part of the mornings on Penner's Cove Road the way the water was part of the mornings, present, unremarkable, missed only when it stopped. She said he was the kind of man who always had a cup ready for anyone who stopped by, that there was a kettle on the small stove in the shop's back corner from the first cold morning of autumn to the last, and that she had drunk tea in this shop more times than she could count, and that the tea was always strong and always hot, and never accompanied by more conversation than either party wanted. She said he was the kind of man who gave you what you needed without requiring you to ask for it. She said it looking at the hull. She said it like a standard she intended to hold herself to. She spent those 2 weeks learning the shop and the boat the way she had learned every other thing she had learned well, by paying close attention and keeping her hands busy. She swept the shed floor section by section, cataloging the tools she found, and there were tools, many of them, hung on the original pegs along the south wall and laid in wooden racks along the bench that ran under the windows. Draw knives and spoke shaves. Planes of every size, from a 40-inch trying plane to a thumb plane no bigger than her palm. Caulking mallets and irons. A set of spiling batons, thin flexible strips of pine for taking the shape of a hull curve, stored in a bundle and still true. A bevel gauge, a marking gauge, a pair of dividers, all of it oiled before Donald Keel had left, and all of it waiting in the particular patience of good tools left in the right conditions. She also found, in a wooden box on the lower shelf of the bench, a set of drawings, rolled and tied with linen tape on drafting paper that had yellowed at the edges but remained legible at the center. Lines plans, offsets, construction drawings, the complete design documentation for the hull on the stocks. The designer's name was in the title block at the lower right of each sheet. A man named Horace Leithwaite, a naval architect who had practiced in the northern coastal states from the 1930s through the 1960s, and whose designs, Sable would learn, were considered among the finest small craftwork of the period. The design was a 38-foot double-ended cutter, the kind of boat built for offshore sailing, for deep water and long passages, for a person who intended to go somewhere and not just look at the horizon. She called a man named Bram Soloway, who ran the wooden boat restoration program at a maritime school 2 counties up the coast, whose name she had from a flyer she'd seen at Dunn's Ways the previous year. She called him because she wanted a second opinion from someone who knew what they were looking at, and because she was not yet certain enough in her own assessment to trust it entirely. Bram came on a Saturday with 2 of his students, and he spent 3 hours with the hull and the drawings and the tools, and when he was done, he sat on the bench and said that the hull was structurally sound, that the Leithwaite design was among the most respected in the wooden boat world, that the tool collection was extraordinary, and that whoever had set up this shop and started this build had been a craftsman of the highest order. He said, "Whoever finishes this boat will have something people sail for 50 years." She went under the Keel platform on the 15th day. The boards came up on the 3rd nail with a pry bar she had found on the bench rack. Beneath the platform, in the dry space protected by the hull overhead and the platform below, resting on a layer of folded canvas that had kept out the cove's damp for over 50 years, were 2 things. The first was a wooden chest, roughly 24 inches long and 16 wide, built from the same cedar as the boat's planking, with brass corner hardware and a brass clasp that opened without a key. Inside the chest, wrapped in oilskin and then in soft cloth, were 41 bronze fittings, chain plates, deadeyes, cleats, fairleads, a pair of bronze cabin portlights with beveled glass, the full suite of deck hardware for the Leithwaite cutter, each piece cast to the specifications in the drawings, each piece wrapped individually and laid in the chest in the order they would be installed. They were not corroded. They were not damaged. They were ready to go on the boat, exactly as they had been placed the day Donald Keel locked his shop and walked away. The second thing was a letter, sealed in an envelope of heavy creamstock, addressed in a clear and unhurried hand to whoever finishes her. She opened it on the floor of the keel space, sitting cross-legged with the chest in her lap and the hull curving above her like the inside of something alive. The letter said, "I started this boat in 1966 and worked on her for 5 years. She is a Leithwaite No. 7, and there were only 11 built to this design in her time, and I believe she is the last unfinished one. I had to leave before she was done. That has been with me every year since. I am leaving the fittings because they belong to her and to whoever is willing to finish what I started. I am leaving the tools because a person who has found this place and come this far will know how to use them. I am leaving the drawings so that it is done right. One request only. When she is finished, take her out past the headland and into open water, and sail her on a reach in a good wind, and let her show you what she can do. She has been waiting a long time for that. So have I, in whatever way a man waits for things after he is gone. Sail her well. She sat under the hull for a long time. The cove light came through the gap in the roof above the stocks, and it fell on the bronze fittings in the open chest. And the green of aged bronze in that particular light was a color she had no word for. She was 20 years old. She was sitting under a boat that a man she had never met had built and left for her and trusted her to finish. She had $66 minus 10. She had a set of tools that had been waiting for 33 years, and a set of drawings, and 41 bronze fittings wrapped in cloth and oilskin. She had her hands and her training, and everything she had learned at Dunn's ways, and everything her father had shown her on the water when she was 10, and 11, and 12. She had enough. Bram Soloway came back the following month with the news of the fittings and the letter, which Sable had told him about on the phone in the way she told him most things, plainly and without excessive drama, and he said he had a proposal. The maritime school he ran had been looking for a long-term restoration project of exactly this caliber. He could offer the school's workshop, its equipment, and a supervised environment for the build, plus a small stipend for her time as lead builder, in exchange for the educational documentation of the restoration process. She would remain the boat's owner. The school would document. When the build was complete, the documentation would be donated to the Wooden Boat Foundation's archive, and the boat would sail under her name. She said yes on the spot. She did not need to think about it. She packed the chest of fittings and the rolled drawings into the trunk of Tess's car. Tess had offered, and Sable had accepted, because some offers are made by people who understand exactly what they are offering, and she started work 3 weeks later. Cresswell found out through the marine community, which in that part of the coast was a network as tightly wound as standing rigging and nearly as reliable. A maritime school finishing a Leithwaite cutter from original fittings and original drawings was the kind of news that moved through boatyards and sailing clubs and wooden boat forums, and it moved to Cresswell by way of a man at his distributorship who had a son at the maritime school. He called Irene. Irene called Sable. She said she had heard from Cresswell, and Cresswell had said it sounded like a wonderful thing, and that he was glad Sable had landed well. He had not mentioned the $22,000. He had not asked to visit the boat. Sable thought that was probably right. She told her mother she was glad too, and she meant it, and she let the rest of it be what it was. She did not carry it. She had set it down the day she walked out of the house above the chandlery and got on the bus to Penner's Cove Road, and she had not picked it up since. And the weight she was not carrying had left her hands free for other things, which was always the point. She started leaving offcuts at the end of the Cove Road lane 3 months into the build. Not scraps. Good timber. The pieces trimmed from the cedar planking repairs and the replacement of the worst of the weathered topsides, material someone could use. She stacked them neatly at the lane's end, and she did not say anything about them to anyone, because Donal Keir had not said anything about his. And that seemed right. The pile was gone within a week, taken in portions by people she never saw. She restocked it the following week, and the week after. Some things asked to be continued rather than concluded. The Leithwaite cutter on the stocks at Penner's Cove had been asking for 53 years, and it had asked in the most patient possible way, by simply staying there. Hull true and fittings wrapped, and keel space sealed, waiting for the person who would come in through a door left unlocked by a county that had stopped paying attention, and kneel on the floor to read a brass tag and understand without being told what ready meant and how to become it. She was 20 years old, and she had $66 and a bus ticket to a cove road at the edge of the season, and the shack at the end of it had been holding a place for her since the summer of 1971, which was 29 years before she was born, which is the kind of thing that makes no logical sense, and which is also, somehow, exactly right. The boat launched on a Saturday in June, 3 years and 4 months after Sable paid $10 for the right to finish her. The launch was small. Tess came, and Bram and 2 of his students, and Orvis Bale appeared at the yard gate in his county jacket and stayed for the whole afternoon without explaining why, and a few others from the Cove Road and the Maritime School. Sable sailed her out past the headland alone, because the letter had asked for that specifically, and she put her on a reach in the southwest wind that was blowing a steady 15 that day. And she let her go. And the hull moved the way a well-designed hull moves in good air, with a kind of settled certainty, as though the water had been arranged for exactly this. She thought about Donal Keir out past the headland. She thought she understood what he had been waiting for. She keeps the brass tag on the shelf above her bunk. It says what it always said. She has decided it will say it to whoever sails her after, which is as it should be. If this story found something in you tonight, we'd be grateful if you subscribed. It is what keeps this channel going, and every one of you matters to us. And we have one question we'd love you to answer in the comments. Has there ever been something unfinished that came to you? A project, a plan, a piece of work someone else had to put down, and you were the one who picked it up and carried it the rest of the way? Tell us about it, if you're willing. We'll read every word. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.